Right, good morning everybody, and this is the first video on our synthesis worksheet 4 on although, in spite of, despite, and owing to and because, all right? Now these are connectors of reason, and the first set, although, in spite of, and despite, deal with connectors that tell you reasons that do not stop something from happening, all right? So they do not stop a particular behavior or an event from occurring. So although it rained heavily, so notice that the connector although is linked to the reason, the raining heavily. So although it rained heavily, comma, everyone enjoyed the outing. So take note here that the fact that it was raining, although it rained heavily, does not stop something from happening. Everyone enjoyed the outing, okay? So although it rained heavily, because although the connector is in front, there is a comma in the middle. In spite of the heavy rain, comma, again, in spite of is in front. In spite of can also take the fact that, and despite can also say the fact that, all right? So that's although, in spite of, and despite. Now, if I look at due to, owing to, because of, on account of, these are reasons that cause something. Now, this is different from in spite of, despite, and although. Those were reasons that do not cause something. These are reasons that cause something. So notice here, due to and owing to come before the reason, just like although, in spite of, and despite. They're connected to the reason, but they do not, in this case, they do cause something to happen. So the excursion was cancelled due to, owing to, or because of the torrential downpour. Okay, so in this case, notice that the connector is still linked to the reason, but it causes something to happen. In this case, the cancellation of the excursion. Okay, so this is important to note that the contrast between although, in spite of, and despite tells you how and when to use it. All right, contrast with owing to, because of, and on account of. All right, so these are the two main connectors, and we're going to go ahead and do the questions now. All right, so you should already have done this, and you may have some alternative answers that you wish to check with me, but generally speaking, I'm going to use the fact that as the way to solve these answers. All right, so despite the fact that, let us just change the orientation of this. So despite the fact that the elderly man was feeble, comma, he helped a commuter, and be very careful here that commuter is spelled correctly, alight from the bus. All right, so despite the fact that is something that I always add on, and then I just take this, the elderly man was feeble, as my first portion. I insert a comma because connector is in front, and then I insert the second part of my answer. So the connector despite always follows the reason, right? In this case, the reason is the elderly man was feeble, all right? So despite, for the second part, if despite comes to the center of the sentence, I just need to make my reason follow my connector. So in this case, despite the fact that he was feeble. Now notice here that I have changed the position and the pronoun because the subject should be in the front of the sentence. So the elderly man helped a commuter alight from the bus. All right, I hope that kind of clarifies it. So remember, whenever you have a connector, despite, the reason always follows it. And if the reason is in the front of the sentence, the subject should always be there. If it is at the back of the sentence, the pronoun should replace it. So in this case, you'll notice that the elderly man has switched places with the pronoun he, because I should always put my subject in the front of the sentence to make it clear who I'm talking to, so it's very clear, right? So it's the same thing for in spite of. All right, let me just do a bit of a shortcut. All right, I'm going to cut this portion here. And I'm going to copy this here. Okay, in spite of the fact that the elderly man was feeble, comma, and same thing over here. Right, so you'll notice that in spite of and despite actually are exactly the same in their function. All right, so you might ask, so why do I have two forms? Well, there are certain situations where you would use in spite of and not despite, and vice versa, but those situations are few and far between. Most of the time, in spite of and despite occupy the same function in sentence construction, all right? So, likewise, it's the same thing for in spite of coming in the center of the sentence, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this over as well. So the elderly man helped a commuter alight from the bus in spite of the fact that he was feeble is exactly the same. Right, there's no change to my functionality. Right, and again, the pronoun he is switching places with the subject, the elderly man, because I want the elderly man to be forefronted in the beginning of my sentence so that it's clear who I am talking about. All right, so it's quite clear, as you all can see, that it's quite standard in the way that this is done. So always remember to bracket and number and annotate your synthesis as you're doing it, and checking through your synthesis rules number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 as you are doing your synthesis to make sure that there's no change in meaning, no change in tenses. As the connector moves to the front, a comma takes its place, the answer cannot be longer than the question itself, and that you replace any repeated subjects with pronouns. All right, so these are the 5 synthesis rules that you must keep in mind. Excuse me, right? So the next question, so I'm going to use the fact that, right? So this is going to be first, and then this is going to be second. So despite the fact that my best friend won the top prize in the Scrabble competition, and take note, Scrabble here is capital S, because if you don't do that, you lose a mark. It's a punctuation error, right? Comma, right? Remember to insert a comma because the connector is in front. He was very humble. All right, so despite the fact that my best friend won the top prize, so he won the top prize, but that did not stop him from being very humble. So remember, despite, in spite of, although does not stop something from happening. All right, so my subject here in my pronoun is here. So it's in its correct place. The subject is in front because it should be at the beginning of the sentence, right? So no problems here. If I move to the other side, then it's going to be the other way around. I've got to switch the subject, right? So in spite of the fact that, always remember the reason follows the connector. He won the top prize in the Scrabble competition. Right, I'm writing a little bit bigger, so not getting enough space, but please don't make the same mistake as me. Scrabble must be capital S. Be careful over here. This must be capitalized. He has to switch places with my subject later, all right? So, my best friend was very humble, right? And here, my best friend changes places with the connector he, all right? So it's pretty straightforward. You'll notice that the reason always follows the connector, and that if the reason is in front, the subject is in front. If the reason is behind, then the subject becomes a pronoun he, right? And no longer the actual subject, my best friend, right? So keep all these things in mind, all right, as we go on with the rest of the questions for this section. Okay, question number 3. Owing to the fact that I was careless, comma, all right? Right, because of the fact that I was careless, right? I broke mother's precious vase. All right? So, owing to the fact that I was careless, I broke mother's favorite vase. Father retired early. He was in poor health on account of the fact that, all right, so I am pretty sure that you have gotten the hang of using the fact that now. It's quite simple. So what was the reason for father's early retirement? He was in poor health, right? And then this becomes my number 2. So on account of the fact that father was in poor health, he retired early. Right, so notice here that again there's a comma. When there's a connector in front, a comma takes the place of the connector in the middle, and the fact that the subject is now in the front so that it's clear who is in poor health. Let's move on to the next section, question number 5. So again, because of the fact that, so what caused the refusal to apologize? It was the pride, right? Because of the fact that, okay, so I've got to rephrase this here. Because of the fact that she, or the sales girl, was proud, comma, she refused to apologize for her misconduct. All right? So again, sales girl is the subject. And here, notice that I have changed the configuration or the arrangement of the proud becomes the fact that the sales girl was proud. Okay? So how do I decide that this is was? Because the rest of my sentence is in the past tense, refused, right? So I keep the tense consistent because of synthesis rule number 2, which tells me that I cannot change the tense of a sentence, right? So because of the fact that the sales girl was proud, she refused to apologize for her misconduct. Later on, I'll go through this again and I'll show you a simpler or a different way to do this without using the fact that, all right? So this is question 5. We have quite a few more to go. So let's just finish up with the fact that. Alright, so this is rather tricky. If I'm using the fact that, then the diligent boy helped Simon, right? Because the diligent boy helped Simon pass his examinations. So owing to the fact that the diligent boy helped Simon, right, he passed his examinations, right? So be very careful here. This is quite tricky if you are using the fact that. So later on I'll show you a better way and a clearer way for you to do questions that are a bit more difficult to attach the fact that to, right? So be patient, we'll come back to this later. Okay, why can't he eat the seafood pizza? Right, because or due to the fact that he is allergic to prawns. Right, again, I am bringing my subject to the front of the sentence. Danny and he have switched places. Okay, so be very careful. Keep the consistency of the tenses as well. Remember all your synthesis rules. Okay, to lose your bearings means to get lost. Okay, so in case some of you are wondering what it means to lose your bearings, right? Okay, because of the fact that the compass was faulty, right? So again, you notice that it is quite simple to use the fact that. It's quite consistent. However, you may encounter some challenging situations like I outlined above, all right? Okay, so just highlight a few things. There's a comma here. It's a very, very long sentence. And the latest computer gadgets is repeated, right? These computer gadgets. So I replace them with them. According to synthesis rule number 5, when I have a repeated subject, I replace with pronouns. Okay, so be very alert and aware of any repeated subjects, especially in long sentences where you can get a bit lost and forget that there is a repeated subject and you forget to replace it with a pronoun. So in this case, be careful for question number 9. Alright, so I'm just going to cut and paste this because it's the same answer. Right over here. Right, and then I'm going to change this to she because after all it's been repeated. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy the other side. Okay, sorry about that rather untidy but I'm trying to save some time here. So grandmother is comfortable in handling the latest computer gadgets owing to the fact that she's been constantly exposed to them. All right, so that's kind of the same way. It's just that owing to moves to the middle. Right, and here is what comes down. Okay, so over here is what distressed the tutor was the fact that, so I insert a was. Okay, was the fact that his students had performed poorly in the test. Okay, so over here, notice that I changed performed to had performed. Why is this the case? Simply because what distressed the tutor was is in the simple past tense. Remember, when we have two events happening one after another, one is in the simple past and the other is in the past perfect. So was the fact that his students had performed poorly in the test. So simple past, past perfect. So if I want to use the fact that, I have to be alert to when I need to change the simple past to the past perfect. And again, there's a simpler way to do this. So stay tuned to that, all right? I apologize, I'm having a bit of a morning sinus. Right, so members of the club did not have to pay to be admitted to the workshop. So this one is a little bit different from the rest already. All right, so let's just go ahead and do it. It's not going to be the fact that anymore. So did not have to be paid to be admitted has to change, right? So they enjoyed, did not have to pay becomes free, and admitted becomes admission. All right, so members of the club enjoyed free admission to some workshops. All right, so members of the club enjoyed free admission to some workshops. Did not have to pay becomes free, and to be admitted becomes admission. All right, next one. The fact that my parents right, so I've got to change this. I was becomes made me. So the fact that my parents did not buy me the gift they had promised. So notice had promised, made me, so simple, miserable. Okay, this fact, the fact that my parents did not buy me the gift I wanted, this fact made me miserable. So I have to insert a made me here in order to complete my response. Right, let's move on. Question number 13. They did not accept Judy's contributions. So here's her many contributions, right? So none of Judy's contributions were, or rather was, be very careful here, was accepted by them. Okay, so again, they becomes them, did not accept becomes was accepted, and Judy's contributions becomes none of Judy's contributions. And again, none of is always singular. So be a little bit alert if you have the word none of here, right? It's always in the singular because 0 is considered as singular in English, all right? So over here, honest and generous becomes honesty and generosity. So the workers, honesty and generosity, was impressed or becomes impressed because I am doing active passive voice. The manager and the workers change in their position. So impressed. So this impressed the manager. The workers' honesty and generosity. All right. So that's question 14. Moving to a quick end of this worksheet. I think that's all. Let's go back and then I'll show you some alternative ways to do the questions with the fact that. All right. So over here, I'm going to use a different color so you all can see more clearly. Despite the fact that the elderly man was feeble, he helped a commuter alight from the bus. So over here, if I do not want to use this extended sentence, I can shorten it. All right. So despite the elderly man's feebleness, right? That is an alternative. Question number 2. Despite the fact that my best friend, I'm going to change this. You know what? Actually, I can change this earlier example to an even shorter one. Okay? So let's change this in the spirit of being even shorter, despite being feeble, comma, the elderly man helped a commuter alight from the bus. Okay, so in this case, because the quality of feebleness is highlighted and the subject is no longer in the front, it goes to the back of the sentence. So it's no longer despite the fact that the elderly man was feeble, despite being feeble, the elderly man helped a commuter alight from the bus. The second example is similar. Despite winning the top prize in the Scrabble competition, my best friend was very humble. Okay, so that works as well. Question number 3. So owing to the fact that I was careless, so owing to my carelessness, comma, right, I broke mother's favorite vase, right? That works. And this one, on account of father's poor health, comma, he retired early. All right. Next one, question number 5. This one is where you can really simplify. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to use the fact that. I can change it to because of her pride, comma, the proud salesgirl refused to apologize for her misconduct. Okay. Question number 6. Okay, owing to the diligent boy's help, Simon passed his examination. All right, that shortens it drastically. All right, so this is the alternative way. Okay, so over here, the fact that he is allergic to prawns due to his, right, so I can change this to due to his allergy to prawns. Right, number 8, I can change this to the faulty compass. And number 9, I can change this to because of grandmother's constant exposure to the latest computer gadgets. Okay, so it's constant exposure, right? Number 10, his students' poor performance. So notice, if I am proficient in grammar, I can transform the words and drastically shorten my answers. Right, question 11, 12, and 13 and 14 remain the same because there is no use of the fact that. Right, so I hope that this has been helpful in reviewing your answers. And if you have any questions or further alternative answers, or if you're unsure, please do not hesitate to drop me a message and I will try to explain it to you. Right?